It started the way trouble usually does, quietly, with a new face and a forced smile. My land sits just outside the suburban utopia known as Lakeside Bluffs. I run a small vineyard there, tend to my rows in peace, and enjoy the quiet that comes from being not part of a homeowners association. My property's independent, grandfathered in before the HOA was established, and I've kept it that way deliberately. Freedom tastes better when no one's trying to regulate your grape variety or dictate the color of your barn door. Things changed when Greg Wallace showed up. I first noticed him while pruning the south row of Cabernet vines. A tall guy, maybe late 50s, early 60s, wearing aviator sunglasses and a jacket, with a faded sheriff's department patch still half attached. He had the gait of a man who missed hearing the crackle of a radio on his shoulder. He was walking the perimeter of the Lakeside Bluffs entrance like he was guarding Fort Knox. At first I figured he was just a particularly uptight neighbor. Those pop up now and then, harmless. Then I saw him stop a teenager on a skateboard, watched him demand the kid's name, ask if he lived in the neighborhood, tell him to slow it down or face a citation. A citation? The hell? I heard later that Greg was a retired cop, 30 years in law enforcement, and apparently still couldn't hang up the badge. Now he'd somehow wormed his way into the HOA board. Not president, but close. Something called Community Oversight Chair. In practice, that meant he was self-appointed sheriff of suburbia. Things escalated fast. One morning, I came out to find Greg at the edge of my property, peering through binoculars toward my tool shed. He lowered them slowly when he saw me. "Just doing a safety sweep," he said, like that explained everything. I stared at him without saying a word. He gave a short nod like we'd agreed on something and walked off. A week later, a patrol car rolled into my driveway. An officer stepped out, clearly uncomfortable. "We got a call about a possible weapons violation," he said, eyes already apologetic. "Something about firearms in public view?" I pointed at the clearly locked gun cabinet inside my workshop, visible only if you stood at the exact right angle outside the window and squinted. The officer took one look and sighed. "We're good here," he said. "Sorry to bother you." They came back again 2 days later, this time over a strong odor of alcohol drifting into the neighborhood. I suppose someone forgot they lived next to a literal vineyard. I started recording every encounter, added more cameras around the property, just in case this nonsense spiraled. And deep down, I already suspected it would. Then came the real line crosser. I was loading barrels into my truck when I heard someone walking up the gravel drive. Greg, again. Only this time, he had a clipboard in hand, and that same stale air of authority. "Need to do a quick visual inspection of your structures," he said, like it was protocol. "Safety compliance and all." I set the barrel down with more force than necessary. "You're not stepping foot on this land, Greg." He bristled. "Sir, your proximity to Lakeside Bluffs places you under potential emergency jurisdiction." "No, it doesn't. This land isn't HOA. You have zero authority here, not a millimeter." He opened his mouth, but I cut him off. "Turn around and walk back to whatever sidewalk made you feel important today." He left, but not before muttering something about irregularities and failing to cooperate. That was the moment I knew. Greg wasn't just playing security. He wasn't out to protect anyone. He was hunting for something, for someone to control. And I'd just landed at the top of his list. The next week played out like a low-budget thriller written by a man who thought every neighbor was a suspect. It started with the cameras. I noticed the first one while checking the outer fence line. It was mounted high on a utility pole just across the county easement, aimed squarely at my front gate. It bore the HOA's sticker, as if that gave it some divine right to observe me. 2 days later, I spotted another, this one smaller, nestled in the trees along the western edge. Damn near invisible unless you knew to look. A third popped up under the pretense of being a community wildlife tracker, which would have been cute if the lens hadn't been pointed straight at my back porch. Greg had officially upgraded from annoying retiree to full-blown surveillance enthusiast. I'm no stranger to a security system. I've had cameras on my land for years, but this was different. This was them watching me, on land they had no claim to. And then came the letter. Printed on HOA letterhead, signed by none other than Karen Manning, the newly elected HOA president, a woman with the charm of a granite countertop and the ethics of a taxidermied rattlesnake. The letter was a masterpiece of euphemistic overreach. It informed me that, due to geographic adjacency and risk concerns, my property had been provisionally designated within the expanded observation perimeter of Lakeside Bluffs. Translation: they made up a perimeter and decided I was in it. According to the letter, this designation came with expectations of cooperative compliance, including, and this part made me laugh, occasional non-invasive property assessments for the safety of the surrounding community. I handed it to my attorney that same afternoon. She snorted, "This isn't worth the paper it's printed on." But I didn't laugh for long, because the next day, 2 HOA volunteers came by, clipboards in hand, pastel polos stretched tight with self-importance, and tried to peer over my fence, citing routine environmental review. I met them at the gate, smiling like a wolf. "You've got 5 seconds to get off my property before you're part of an actual environmental impact study." They left, but Greg didn't. He started loitering again, morning, noon, even after dark. He'd pace the sidewalk near my place like he was waiting for a search warrant to fall from the sky. My motion-activated lights caught him more than once, his silhouette pausing just long enough to make me wonder if he wanted to be seen. One night, I found fresh boot prints in the dust just inside my fence line. Military-style tread. Deep and deliberate. That same night, my power flickered twice. Then my network dropped for 10 full minutes. When it came back, 2 of my exterior cameras had been disabled. Not glitched. Disabled. I checked the logs. The access attempts came from a device on a neighboring mesh network. Not mine. And guess who lived within wireless range? Officer Friendly and his HOA circus. I didn't sleep much that week, but I did install 2 more hardwired cameras, swapped out my router, and set up an isolated server with no remote access. Let them try again. I wasn't just dealing with a bored ex-cop. I was dealing with a man who didn't believe the badge ever came off. And now, thanks to Karen's signature and a handful of fake authority, he thought he had jurisdiction over my life. It was getting clearer by the day. This wasn't just some power trip. It was a campaign. If the previous weeks had been weird, the next few crossed over into something else entirely. Something darker, calculated, and no longer just about HOA harassment. It was coordinated now, strategic, like they'd decided to trade in the neighborhood watch clipboard for a playbook straight out of a Cold War spy thriller. It started with the flyers. They appeared overnight, tucked into mailboxes, taped to community boards, even stapled to a telephone pole near my property line. Bright red headers. Neighborhood Safety Update. Non-compliant property identified. Below was a blurred photo of my front gate and a write-up that would have made a Soviet propagandist blush. It accused me of harboring unlicensed operations, of storing hazardous materials on site, which, I assume, meant wine barrels, and of refusing lawful inspections by HOA safety agents. HOA safety agents. I laughed when I saw that phrase. Then I stopped laughing when my UPS driver asked if I was under investigation. Later that week, a man from the fire department showed up. polite guy, said someone had submitted a formal complaint that my outdoor oven posed a wildfire risk. I walked him around the property, showed him the fire breaks, my sprinkler grid, and the oven itself. A reinforced stone dome I'd built myself, set 20 feet from anything remotely flammable. He shook his head as he made notes. Doesn't make sense, honestly. We only get these kinds of reports when there's a vendetta. You pissed someone off? I raised an eyebrow. You could say that. The very next day, code enforcement arrived. Someone, again, anonymously, had reported illegal agricultural operations on my land. They claimed I was running a commercial production site without a license, which was funny, considering I did have a license, hanging in a frame next to the front door. I gave them coffee and a tour. They left 20 minutes later, shaking their heads at the absurdity of it all. The complaints weren't about me doing anything wrong. They were about exhausting me, drowning me in paperwork, phone calls, and visits until I cracked or gave in. But they'd underestimated one thing. I used to be a detective. I lived in paperwork and harassment. Still, I knew this wasn't just Greg being overzealous. Someone was backing him. Karen hadn't said a word publicly since the first letter, but her name had started showing up on internal communications that mysteriously leaked. One HOA board member, a decent guy named Travis, met me at the fence one evening. He was pale and sweating. Greg's not doing this alone, he said. Karen's letting him run wild, but there's more. He's got something on her, financial, maybe worse. That got my attention. You sure? I heard them arguing. In her garage. He said, and I quote, "You want me to keep quiet about those project bids? You let me do what needs doing." Then she told him not to say that out loud. Her husband was home. I thanked him and walked back to my house, heart pounding harder than I cared to admit. The next night, it escalated. I was locking up the tool shed when I saw movement on the eastern side. A figure in black, crouched low. By the time I got there, whoever it was had disappeared. But they'd left something behind. A small black USB stick jammed halfway into the port of my exterior camera. I took it inside, scanned it on an air-gapped laptop. Malware. Not subtle, either. Designed to disable remote access, overwrite footage, and redirect live feeds to a third-party server. They were trying to hijack my own surveillance system. That was it. I called my private investigator, a guy named Kellen I'd worked with back in my badge days. Gave him everything I had, documents, photos, timestamps, the USB stick, told him I wanted every scrap of dirt he could find on Greg Wallace, and anyone who might be helping him. He nodded once. You think this guy's just on a power trip? I shook my head. No, I think he's building something, and I think Karen's helping him hide the foundation. The first clue that things were about to get truly unhinged came in the form of a man with mirrored sunglasses and too much cologne, standing at my front gate holding a clipboard and a warrant-looking piece of paper that turned out to be, in fact, not a warrant. It was a community incident report, signed by Greg and co-signed by none other than Karen herself. The document declared that my property was now considered a community risk zone due to unverified gatherings and possible illicit substance sales. Illicit substance sales on a vineyard. It might have been funny if it weren't such a blatant setup. The timing was too precise. That same night, I was hosting a small BBQ for some clients and friends. Nothing outrageous, maybe a dozen people, ribs on the smoker, a bit of wine from my cellar, and a Bluetooth speaker playing blues at conversational volume. It was the kind of laid-back night I lived for. Until the flashing lights arrived. 2 police cruisers, followed by a tactical van. Officers jumped out, one of them with his hand hovering over his sidearm. My guests went quiet. You could hear the fire pit crackling over the tension. "Evening," I said calmly, stepping forward with my hands slightly raised. "This some kind of overreaction, or did someone call in a murder?" One of the officers, a young guy, nervous, cleared his throat. "Received a tip about illegal alcohol sales and possible narcotics activity." I almost laughed in his face. "Buddy, unless you're here for the pulled pork and Merlot, you've been lied to." Just then, another officer stepped out of the van, and I recognized him immediately. Andy Morales. We'd served in adjacent districts back in the day. Solid guy. Smart. His eyes widened when he saw me. "Derek?" he said, almost dropping the tactical report in his hand. "Hey, Andy," I said. "Guess who's wasting your time tonight?" He turned to his partner. "We're done here. Shut it down." Greg was parked across the street, of course, standing beside his aging Tahoe like it was a patrol cruiser, arms folded like he was about to read me my rights. Andy walked over to him, exchanged a few words, short, tense. Greg jabbed a finger toward my house, then toward me. Andy didn't budge. I couldn't hear what was said, but Greg's face turned the color of a microwaved hot dog. He peeled out less than a minute later. I walked Andy back to his car. "Let me guess," I said. "Anonymous tip?" He nodded. "But it came through an internal channel, flagged priority. That means it came from someone inside a department, or with an existing clearance." "Greg," I muttered. "I can't prove it," Andy said carefully. "But yeah, it reeks." That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was scared, because I was pissed. This wasn't about neighborhood rules anymore. Greg had weaponized his law enforcement history, his old contacts, and he was using real resources to harass people. To harass me over some deranged sense of jurisdiction. And worse, someone was covering for him. I called Kellen, my private investigator, and asked about the sheriff. Sheriff Troy McKenna. Local golden boy. Re-elected 3 times without a sweat. Kellen had been digging into him already. "What have you got?" I asked. "McKenna and Greg go way back," he said. "Same academy class. Used to partner up on DUI patrols back in '98. Greg was McKenna's best man, according to a now-deleted Facebook album I managed to dig up." "Okay, that's more than just a buddy system." "Here's the kicker," Kellen said. 4 complaints against Greg during his final years on the force. 3 internal, 1 civilian. All got buried or dismissed. Guess who signed off on the internal reviews? Don't say it. Sheriff McKenna. So that was it. Greg wasn't just acting out some post-retirement cowboy fantasy. He was shielded, protected, and that made him dangerous. Meanwhile, I was now the neighborhood boogeyman, the mysterious man on the hill with the unlicensed gatherings. HOA emails had started referring to me in coded language, the adjacent property, unsecured sector, and once, hilariously, potential extremist. I filed an official complaint with the sheriff's office the next morning. I laid out the false calls, the harassment, the surveillance, the breach attempts. I attached video, statements, a full record. I even flagged the incident with Andy Morales. The response? A brief email. After review, the department has determined there is no actionable misconduct at this time. That was McKenna's signature at the bottom. I forwarded it straight to my attorney, added it to the growing case file, then stared out my window at the HOA-installed camera across the road. If they wanted war, I'd give them one. But this time, it wouldn't be quiet. They wanted a Cold War. I gave them a spotlight. It began with a press conference. Nothing fancy, just me, a rented podium, 2 local news crews, and a stack of evidence tall enough to block the sun. I set up right outside the HOA's perfectly manicured community center. That morning, I emailed copies of my compiled case files to every major HOA resident, 2 city council members, and 3 reporters who'd previously covered suburban scandals. Timing was key. I waited until right after the HOA's monthly brunch meeting, when Karen, Greg, and the rest of their Stepford council were still inside sipping coffee over bylaws. I stepped up to the mic like I was back in court, laid out the whole damn narrative. The surveillance, the fake complaints, the malware stick someone tried to jam into my system. And then I dropped the bomb. Financial transfers from the HOA's discretionary Community Beautification Fund directly to a shell company tied to Greg's old security consulting license, and approved by Karen herself. You could hear the news cameras whir to life like a pack of waking hounds. I showed footage of Greg prowling my fence line at night, audio clips of a recorded conversation where Karen told a former board member to keep things quiet unless you want to lose your committee chair. I ended with a snapshot of the forged expanded observation zone letter signed by Karen, alongside a real zoning map, clearly proving my land was outside any jurisdiction of Lakeside Bluffs. I didn't need applause. I needed outrage. And I got it. By sundown, 3 board members had resigned. The HOA's inbox was flooding, and by morning, the county had issued an official request to begin investigation into allegations of civil overreach and possible criminal misconduct by members of the Lakeside Bluffs HOA leadership. But that wasn't enough. Not for me. With Kellen's help, and a judge who didn't enjoy being lied to, we secured a warrant. Operation Light, we called it. Appropriate since our goal was to drag every secret out of its hiding place. Greg's house got raided at dawn. The sheriff's department had to stand down on this one. Oversight was pulled in from the state after I handed in a conflict of interest brief naming McKenna. Instead, a task force out of the Attorney General's office carried it out. Clean, quiet, ruthless. What they found was worse than I expected. Hidden folders of personal information on over a dozen residents, surveillance logs, printed transcripts of intercepted text messages, flash drives full of video footage, not just from public areas, but interior feeds from 2 homes, illegally installed cameras. One marked Karen's request. That one hit hard. Then came the weapons. 3 unregistered firearms, a taser modified to deliver double voltage, zip ties, lockpicks. They even found a laminated map with markers, stars in red ink, including one on my property. At that point, Greg wasn't just paranoid. He was dangerous. Karen tried to distance herself immediately, claimed she didn't know, hadn't approved anything. But then Kellen handed over a recovered email. Subject line, Re-Watchlist Updates, signed K. The mask was off, and so was the shield. Greg was arrested on site. Karen was picked up hours later, trying to leave town with 2 duffel bags and a phone she'd tried to factory reset. Sheriff McKenna was served with a subpoena, his office sealed for investigation. For the first time in weeks, my land felt quiet. But I knew the real noise was still coming. The courthouse buzzed like a kicked hornet's nest. Reporters packed the hallway, local stations ran live segments, and someone, probably from the HOA Facebook group, had set up a folding table with Justice for Lakeside merch. I saw a mug with my face on it. I didn't know whether to laugh or file a cease and desist. Inside, the courtroom was standing room only. The judge, a sharp woman with a face that could curdle milk, made it clear from the start. No games, no delays, no side theatrics. The prosecution opened with a display of the surveillance wall, a full projector screen showing the camera feeds Greg had collected. It looked like the set of a low-budget spy thriller, except it was real, and everyone in the room could feel it. Greg sat there like a man carved from a single block of smug, hands folded, eyes darting. Karen, in contrast, looked like a mannequin dressed for a perp walk. Hollow eyes, powdered face, spine straight but fragile. They were charged with a collection of crimes that sounded more like a menu than an indictment. Unlawful surveillance, harassment, possession of unregistered firearms, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of authority. Sheriff McKenna had his own separate trial pending, but his name came up enough to stain the walls. Witnesses came one by one. First was Travis, the ex-HOA board member, who told the court about overhearing Karen and Greg arguing in the garage, Greg threatening to expose financial documents unless he got full discretion. His voice cracked halfway through, not from fear, from shame. Then came the mother of a teenager Greg had stopped and interrogated by the mailbox, demanding ID and photographing his skateboard like it was a concealed weapon. She cried on the stand. The kid sat in the front row, stone-faced, arms folded. And then I took the stand. I gave them the whole story, from the first fake police call to the malware-laced USB, from the shadowy figures in my vineyard to the night the SWAT team arrived at my barbecue. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. The truth was ugly enough. Greg's attorney tried to paint me as combative, uncooperative, resistant to community standards. "I'm not part of your community," I said calmly. "That was the point. Always has been." The courtroom was silent. Then the prosecution dropped the hammer. Intercepted emails between Karen and Greg. One where Karen wrote, "Make him look unstable. We can't risk exposure. Get McKenna involved if you have to." That was it. Game over. After 6 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They returned with full convictions on all counts. Greg was sentenced to 24 years without parole. Karen got 18, plus financial restitution to every resident targeted under her term. Sheriff McKenna, who'd been subpoenaed mid-trial, was arrested before the verdict was even finished being read. The HOA, as an entity, was fined, audited, and dissolved pending full reformation. The board was wiped clean. Independent oversight appointed by the court would supervise any attempt to restructure. As for me, the judge looked directly at me when she read the final order. Compensatory damages in the amount of $200,000 to be paid in full by the Lakeside Bluffs HOA and the individual defendants. It wasn't just a win. It was a purge, a damn exorcism of suburban tyranny wrapped in khakis and bylaws. As I walked out of the courthouse, someone handed me one of those mugs with my face on it. I kept it. 6 months later, my land finally breathed again. The vineyard was in full bloom, the summer sun pouring across the rows like honey. Birds had replaced drones, laughter had replaced arguments, and the only cameras on the property were mine, where they belonged. The HOA technically still existed, but in name only. Court-appointed oversight had turned their weekly meetings from petty echo chambers into actual neighborhood forums. New faces had taken the lead. People who understood community wasn't about power, but about boundaries, respect, and keeping your nose out of other people's irrigation schedules. I hadn't joined, of course, still had no intention to, but I did start showing up at meetings as a guest expert on property law and personal sovereignty, unofficially dubbed the man who sued the suburb. I leaned into it. I even had a little wooden sign carved and mounted by my front gate, just to make things crystal clear. It read, "Private property. Cameras on. Sheriffs by appointment only." And just beneath it, in smaller letters, "No HOA jurisdiction beyond this point." The first time Travis came by after the trial, now acting as interim chair of the new board, he stood in front of the sign and laughed, until he cried. We drank wine under the arbor and toasted to what we jokingly called the revolution. But it wasn't really a joke. The fallout from the trial had sparked conversations far beyond lakeside bluffs. Articles popped up about HOA overreach, misuse of former law enforcement status, the gray area between public authority and private enforcement. People started asking questions, good ones, questions they should have asked a long time ago. The compensation money helped, sure. I rebuilt part of the south fence, expanded the fermentation shed, and funded a weekend workshop for property owners called Know Your Land, legal defense for the independent-minded. It sold out in 2 days. But the real payoff? Peace. Peace, not in the absence of people, but in the absence of petty tyrants. We even threw a harvest festival in early October. No permits required. No HOA clipboard patrol. Just neighbors, music, food, laughter, a bonfire, and wine. Lots of wine. Midway through the evening, someone tapped a spoon against a glass and said, "Let's hear from Derek." I stood up on a hay bale, raised my cup, and said, "To fences that protect, not divide. To rules that serve, not control. And to neighborhoods that remember. We're neighbors, not deputies." Cheers erupted. As the sun went down behind the vines, casting golden shadows across my land, I felt it deep in my bones. This wasn't just my home anymore. It was proof.